Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Asian Leadership Conference webinar series. I'm Insan Kang, the editor for Global Affairs at the Chosun Ilbo. This webinar is co-hosted by the Chosun Ilbo and the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. One of the greatest challenges we face now is a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. How serious are these tensions, and what is the nature of this conflict? And what should we do to survive and thrive under this pressure? We will discuss it with three prominent experts from the US, Japan, and Korea. Let me introduce our panelists today. Professor James Steinberg is with me, a former Deputy Secretary of State under Obama administration, and now he teaches at Syracuse University. And Dr. Yoichi Funabashi is with us. He is a chairman of a Asia Pacific Initiative and former editor-in-chief of Asahi Shimbun in Japan. And we have Seung-joo Han. Dr. Seung-joo Han is a chairman of Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and he's a former foreign minister, and he's a Korean ambassador to the United States. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks a lot. Well, now we are entering a new situation, which is quite new. I mean, the relations between the China and the US, these days we call it confrontation and tension and disputes, and we call it and we have noted lots of hostilities between them. And my first question is Professor Steinberg. And now we talk about the emergence of a new Cold War between US and China. But only a few years ago, we talked about cooperation and competition between the two countries. Initially, President Trump seemed to get along with the President Xi Jinping very well, but it's not like that anymore. Things changed a lot. What do you think have happened to make two countries' relationship so antagonistic? And what is Trump's primary goal in dealing with China and Xi Jinping?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for having me. It's a very timely opportunity to talk with you and the many people who are listening to this webinar. You know, I think the relationship has been encountering increasing difficulty over a number of years. I really see this as a process that's been unfolding over the last decade. I think it's important to understand how we got here. For many years, from the beginning of the opening to China under President Nixon, the two countries had important differences and periods of tension, but both basically saw the positive sum, the win-win side of the relationship as being more important than the issues where we disagreed. And that worked in part because the United States was much stronger and much more powerful than China. And so China was not in any sense a threat to the United States, but there were great opportunities for the United States in working with China during the Cold War in terms of working with China and dealing with the Soviet Union, but also in economics. As China began the reform and opening up, it became a great economic opportunity for the United States. And too needed the United States. If China was going to prosper, it needed to trade with the United States, it needed investment from the United States, it needed technology from the United States. So China had an interest in not challenging the United States, not threatening the United States. But as China became stronger economically and then later militarily, the tensions grew greater. China had the potential of becoming a threat, and China began to think about whether it wanted to still live in a world where the United States was the dominant power. And so over time, as China began to grow and to rise, the relationship began to feel more of these frictions. And what's happened over the last several years is we now focus on the areas where there are tensions, where we see that one side might benefit to the expense of the other, rather than thinking about the areas of cooperation. So as long as we focus on those areas of confrontation and competition, as China becomes closer to the United States, it's going to be very difficult to manage the relationship. And that has nothing to do with President Trump. It's a deeper problem in the relationship. But President Trump, during his campaign, also made an issue of China and standing up to China. So it's the combination of these deeper forces plus the political impulse of President Trump, I think, that's brought us to this period where relationships are dramatically worse than they've been in the past.
I see. Dr. Funabashi, do you think this is likely to get worse as years go by, who comes to power? Or is it just a passing phenomenon that will be gone in a few years and the situation will improve with the change of leadership in either or in both of the two countries?
I think it is likely to continue to deteriorate in the foreseeable future for various reasons. China certainly will most likely restrain exercising its military power towards the United States. But in terms of geoeconomic terms, I think that China will pursue the technological hegemony and economic coercion, expansion of sphere of influence at the expense of the United States. So I think that's the area which the world will likely witness a new Cold War between the US and China. As for China, I think that the legitimacy of that Communist Party regime will be not on economic growth, but on the technological hegemony. And then thus, I think the nationalism, particularly anti-American techno-nationalism, intensify. And in the United States, there is now a sort of bipartisan consensus on China as a challenge to the United States. And the business community also has started to demand that the government getting tough on China. And then 66% of the American citizens now holds a very much unfavorable view of China. Yep. Not only the elite, but the public really also is more increasing critical of China. So the public view, it will not change so easily once it's consolidated. And on top of that, during the Obama administration, the global issues such as pandemic and climate change actually has really helped the US and China, both of them pursue the engagement policy. But as the world is now seeing the global issues such as pandemic now being increasingly weaponized, that the global issues as a last bastion for engagement policies now collapsing.
I see. Ambassador Han, do you think the nature of the current state of the US and China relations is structural? Is it an inevitable friction between a rising power and a status quo power? So what do you think about this?
Well, it's interesting that the Chinese don't really call this a new Cold War. They normally call it the hegemonial competition between the United States and China. The meaning is that all is happening, all the bad relations are happening because the United States is seeking hegemony, trying to keep it in this area. And so having said that, I think the thinking is that on our part, that is on the part of the West and allies of the United States, US, Japan, Korea, we tend to think of it as more structural in that as China is a rising power and the US is a status quo power, there is going to be necessarily conflict, as there was between Athens and Sparta back in the Thucydides period. But the answer to your question is that obviously that it's both. We had the kind of structure in international relations which will tend to lead us to see a conflict between the rising power and the Britain power. But at the same time, maybe coincidentally, in the half part of the 2000s, about 10 years ago, we saw the emergence of two very ambitious leaders, Xi Jinping in China and Donald Trump in the United States. And with, I would say, megalomaniacal tendencies, if I can use that term. One person a little more so than the other. And certainly their presence and their rise did not help the situation. And so we may see a different situation when they are eventually gone and replaced by people who seem to be a little more reasonable and rational.
There's some follow-up questions. So you mean that the personality of the leadership, I mean, Xi Jinping and Trump, that have affected a lot of the current state? Did it mean?
Yes, after Xi Jinping, during his first term, he didn't really show his nails and teeth, but he began to talk about the Chinese dream. He began to flex Chinese muscles and put pressure on other countries, countries like Korea and Southeast Asian countries, and try to use Chinese hard power to put pressure on them. And also, they are working very hard on their military. They want to check the United States, challenge the U.S., and obviously, Donald Trump is talking about Make America Great Again, which is the manifestation of rote nationalism, which is being seen in both China and the U.S.
I see. Professor Steinberg, tensions between the U.S. and China are long-standing phenomenon, as you just said, but the pandemic and the U.S. presidential election have amplified this sort of tension. And what do you think Trump is trying to do with China to win the re-election?
So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that China has been a difficult issue in American presidential elections ever since the Communist Revolution in 1949.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Look at almost every presidential election over the last 70 years. The challenger has challenged the incumbent president on the grounds that they were soft on China, whether that was, you know, against President Truman, or whether it was President Reagan challenging President Carter, or Bush challenging President Clinton's successor, President Gore. This is the standard pattern in foreign policy. So I think inevitably elections tend to bring out situations where the challenger will always say, I'm going to do a better job of protecting the U.S. interest. And China is it's an easy target in elections. So that part I think is very familiar. But I agree with Funabashi-san that the situation has changed so that it's not just a short-term phenomenon. Because I think what's happened is that each side now has reached the conclusion that the other side does not wish the other well. Each side believes, in the case of China, I think there's a growing belief that the United States is trying to contain and weaken China. In the United States, there's an increasing sense that China is trying to take over the world, to push the United States out of Asia, to impose a China-centric world with Chinese values and authoritarian forms of government on the rest of the world. And when believes that the is out to do each other harm, everything is seen through that lens. Everything is, when you take something like COVID, rather than seeing this as an opportunity for cooperation, each it as the other trying to do harm. And I think that's the problem. It's the framework within which you see a phenomenon. The facts don't speak for themselves.
Right, yeah.
Are seen through a lens. And right now, because each mistrusts the other's intentions, then we've seen COVID has become a mirror that reflects those deeper mistrusts.
Can I just intervene for a minute?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
During the past 25 years, each time there was a presidential election in the United States, there was the challenger constantly saying that China is a threat. We have to beware of their intentions and do something about it. And that's what I'm going to do if and when I'm elected. And then there's the new election, new president comes in. Within a few years, the relationship becomes better and they become reasonably good friends. It started with the senior Bush, and then Clinton, and the junior Bush, and so on, until Trump came in. So something definitely happened at the time when Donald Trump became president. And I think Jim explained why that was the case at the beginning. So I am hoping that the past pattern will continue, but unfortunately, there's a new pattern which I hope will not continue this time.
I see. Dr. Han, then let's move on to the other issues, the impact of the tension of US and China. And what do you think is the effect of US-China friction on the rest of the world, especially on Korean Peninsula? How about South Korea? How about North Korea, respectively and together? What do you think we will see in the near future?
Well, if I simplify the answers a little bit, I think North Korea will feel freer to misbehave. China will be a little more indulgent with regard to North Korea than before. China is less likely to cooperate with others, that is the United States, Japan, and South Korea, on denuclearizing North Korea. South Korea, on its part, will feel more pressure to accommodate both powers, which will not be easy. But it has to, South Korea has to take a firm and principled stance. It will have to try to have good relations with both, but be prepared to antagonize one or the other on critical matters, such as THAAD, as it happened a couple of years ago. It is happening now. China has been sometimes unreasonable to exaggerate the threat of THAAD, the threat of what the United States is doing, and trying to recruit the others, including America's allies, to be on the side of the Chinese.
Okay. Dr. Funabashi, what is the current state of Japan and China relations, and what is your prospect?
Well, I think basically we still find the relationship between two countries not as good as both Japanese and Chinese government would like to have the world believe in. China continues to invade into the Senkaku waters by dispatching its militarized Coast Guard vessels so as to test the resolve of Japan, as well as US and Japan, to defend that territory and maintain the alliance in the midst of this pandemic crisis. But at the same time, given that deteriorating U.S. China relationship, China has tried to stabilize the relationship with Japan. And likewise, Japanese government also has found that China's move as expedient to stabilize the relationship. And that also is exactly what that ASEAN countries and other Asian countries also like to see, that Sino-Japan relationship being stabilized. So it's temporarily stabilized, but basically it is a tactical and a convenient arrangement. Japan's dependence on trade. Japan's trade with China is now about 21% in total trade. It's a very much important market as elsewhere. The other countries do. But Japan's lifeline of that security certainly is the U.S.-Japan alliance. So Japan really is now forced to do difficult balancing act. But the most worst case scenario for Japan would be U.S.-China confrontation. During Obama administration, a new type of great power relations between the U.S. and China was Japan's nightmare. But that G2 is not feasible any longer. So Japan doesn't have so many options. At the end of the day, Japan certainly will remain to be, one of the most trusted and trustworthy ally to the United States to maintain that multilateral, free and open global order, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region.
Okay, let's talk about that famous and controversial book on, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to President Trump. And he wrote about the U.S. North Korea's negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program. And John Bolton wrote, for a fourth administration in a row, spanning 30 decades, spanning nearly 3 decades, the U.S. will have failed to stop the world's most serious nuclear proliferation threat. Professor Steinberg, do you agree with John Bolton's assessment?
No, I don't. That won't surprise you. I think that the problem with this kind of way of thinking about the problem is that somehow that if there was some magic bullet that Mr. Bolton or others could use, it would have made any difference. If Mr. Bolton had a good idea how to stop it, he had an opportunity while he was National Security Advisor to do that. The fact is that some problems have to be managed. They just don't get solved. They take a lot of time. There's been a lot of criticism about a concept, which I don't think is the perfect word, but this idea of strategic patience, which recognizes that some problems have to be managed until the overall circumstances change more broadly. And so, yes, it's true that North Korea's nuclear program has grown since the late 1980s under the first President Bush. So how many presidents have we watched this? Yes, a lot of presidents. At the same time, North Korea has not been able to coerce South Korea. It has not been able to force the United States out of the Korean Peninsula. It has not been able to export its nuclear technology. And so we have not solved the problem. There's no question about that. But we've managed the problem. And part of the way we've managed the problem is by staying close in harness, in the most important case, with our allies in South Korea, but also with our allies in Japan, and with some mixed success with China and Russia as well. So you can say that this is a not solved problem, but I also think you have to look at what might otherwise have happened, right? We have not seen further proliferation from North Korea. We've not seen an invasion of North Korea or coercion of South Korea. And so you have to think about this in terms of realistic alternatives that were available. And I think that over several administrations, we have pursued a policy that has sought negotiations with North Korea. I was part of that in the Clinton administration. I was part of that in the Obama administration. But also be clear that we're not going to just get a deal at any price. And so I think that we need to focus more on the relative success of the policy rather than the fact that somehow we didn't make the problem go away.
Well, perhaps I can ask some follow-up questions about that. If John Bolton was not there as a national security advisor for President Trump, do you think there could have been some difference or some progress in denuclearizing efforts?
I just don't know the answer. I mean, part of it is that it's very difficult to peer into President Trump's mind and to know what he would have accepted as a deal, and whether he was so anxious to have a deal that he would have taken an unsatisfactory deal. Certainly, many people were worried about that. I don't know. I mean, I just it's too hard for me to try to speculate what President Trump's done. Bolton wasn't the only one who was worried about the danger that Trump would look for a cosmetic agreement. There were many Republicans in Congress as well as Democrats who were concerned about that. So I just the counterfactual is just hard to judge.
Okay. Dr. Funabashi, how do you think Sino-American rivalry affect inter-Korean relations? Do you think China will choose to side with North Korea despite its provocations and its unwillingness to denuclearize?
Well, I think that it doesn't help at all to solve that issues, nuclear issues and missile issues. Certainly, as Jim said, that U.S. and China has been able to manage that precarious situation, but nonetheless, it has not solved at all, and it's getting worse. And I think that Trump, Kim Jong-un rapprochement really looked surreal. I have called it a surreal politique. But now I would say it really has come to an end. And perhaps in the past, China may have offered to mediate to contain that fallout from that fractured relationship between the U.S. and North Korea. But I don't think China would do that. I think China even might, be happy to see the United States bogged down in that further crisis, as if North Korea would resort to ICBM test and another nuclear test. Napoleon famously said that never stop your enemy when he's making a mistake. This might become to be a new playbook against the United States for China.
I see. Well, Ambassador Han, according to John Bolton's book and many reports, while United States and DP North Korea were doing summit in Singapore and Hanoi, Kim Jong-un was so desperate to get sanction relief, and actually he appears to be getting more and more desperate. I guess the sanction is the only effective leverages we have, U.S. and its allies have over North Korea. And how do you think we can make sanctions more effective to make North Korea give up their nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't agree with Mr. Bolton on many things, but one thing I agree with him is that President Trump's main interest, above all, is his re-election chances in this year, and wanted to use the summit meeting in Singapore and Hanoi to make some hay out of the U.S. North Korea summit meeting. For Kim Jong-il, obviously, sanctions relief is a critical, vital goal for him. Coronavirus is hurting North Korea economically, probably more than other countries. China will be less stringent. We'll try to bypass sanctions at every opportunity. And to answer your question, no, China will not be on the same page on the sanctions issue with the rest of those interested in solving the nuclear issue. There are reports of cash handed being over to the North Koreans by the Chinese on the high seas, and I don't. I cannot verify it, but I don't doubt that that is happening. Mr. Trump sees political interest in making a half-baked deal in North Korean nuclear and missile issues. China and South Korea will probably go along. Such a halfway deal will not be in South Korea's interest, neither it will be in Japan's interest either. For that matter, what South Korea and Japan can do about it is a very questionable kind of thing. So I think in the limited time that is left, Mr. Trump will not want to throw up the Kim Jong-un card, which is a half-baked deal that he can spin as a victory and as a win.
Do you think Kim Jong-un and Trump still have a chance or willingness to do something before his November election?
Well, if they don't do it in a face-to-face meeting, they will probably do something through their surrogates. And Kim Jong-un has nothing to lose because he doesn't. If there is an overall framework which looks like a big deal, but which specifies initially the first steps which will relieve the sanctions, then Kim Jong-un has the sanctions relief. He doesn't have to worry about 3 years, 5 years, 10 years going on. He doesn't feel obligated, or he has to deliver whatever he will promise in the larger big deal that is more superficial than real. The real thing he wants is a short-term deal where the sanctions will be relieved.
I would like to ask the same questions to other panelists. Professor Steinberg, do you think that there's still have a chance for President Trump and Kim Jong-un to do something before U.S. presidential election in November?
So we have a great tradition in the United States of what's known as the October surprise. And there's always a lot of speculation about in every presidential year, what's going to be the October surprise. And I certainly wouldn't rule out the possibility that if President Trump's numbers continue to go down and his prospect for re-election looks poor, that he'll be looking for something. Whether this is the thing he will be looking for is hard to guess. But I think that even if he were tempted in that direction, it might backfire on him, because in order for it to be helpful to the president in the election, people would have to see this as something that was good for the United States. And that put Republicans in a very difficult position. They will have to decide going into the election whether they want to support a weak deal in order to support President Trump, at the risk of themselves being criticized by their Democratic opponents for selling out to North Korea. And if they think Trump's in trouble, the Republicans in the Senate, who will be very important in judging this, may decide that they need to save themselves, sauve qui peut, as the French say, and criticize the deal. So he could end up with a deal that's criticized both by Democrats and Republicans. So Again, I don't know how President Trump thinks. I think he will be attracted to some form of October surprise, but whether this would be the one that would work for him, I'm somewhat skeptical.
I see. What do you think about, Dr. Funabashi, what do you think about this? Do you still think there's a possibility for two of them to try to something before November election?
I would rather doubt that they will have another meeting or some meeting, particularly before the election. I think Trump's hands and cards are now so glaringly revealed by Bolton's expose. And I think that he might even be tempted to use this tension to boost his standing, to play a tough guy role with that election in his mind. So I'm afraid that that relationship between two countries might even deteriorate, and that may perhaps not be that disadvantageous to Trump in electioneering terms.
I see. Professor Steinberg, the US and China blame each other for the coronavirus pandemic. Why is COVID-19 an issue that pushes the US and China further apart? And what will be its lasting effect on their bilateral relations?
You know, as I say, I think it's symptomatic of this deep sense that each is pursuing a strategy that's designed to harm the other. That's the narrative, right? That each is trying to pursue its interest in ways that harms the other country. And so once you buy that framework, then it's easy to make the case that China covered up COVID, failed to cooperate, failed to disclose, with the goal of harming others. And similarly, in the Chinese case, you can get these far-fetched things coming out of foreign ministry spokesmen suggesting that somehow the US Army was behind this. It couldn't be Chinese who were responsible. And it reflects the fact that each is so fundamentally mistrustful of the other side's intentions towards the other one that everything is seen in those terms. Every issue is seen in these, what we in international relations call zero-sum terms. I win, you lose, you win, I lose. And it's a tragedy because there's probably no issue which on its face ought to be one in which it's either lose-lose or win-win. That either if we don't cooperate, it's a disaster for both of us. And yet the relationships have deteriorated so badly that rather than sort of seeing this as an opportunity, one, to help each other, and then to lead the global effort to help the wider world. After all, we, in terms of technology, well, obviously our European friends have a lot of biomedical expertise too, but in many ways, the United States and China were best positioned to lead the research, to lead the efforts to help other countries. And instead it becomes zero sum. China's going to help one country and expect favors in return, whether it's Australia or Serbia or whatever, rather than thinking about this as how can we do it together? How can we work either through the WHO or bilaterally to cooperate? And that really does demonstrate how badly the relationship has deteriorated, because if we can't cooperate on something like this, it's hard to imagine on what we can cooperate.
If you compare the current situation with those of Cold War between China and Soviet Russia, and do you think the tension and confrontation between the US and China is going to be worse than that of the Cold War between the US and Soviet Russia?
I think it will be different. I mean, I think that after all, the primary element of the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was security. It had largely to do with nuclear weapons and missiles, and to some extent it had to do with a competition for influence in third countries. But there were no economic relations at all. The United States did no trade or business with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't have much to offer. It wasn't an attractive market for the United States. Its technology was terrible, except for in the military field. And so what you had was a very dangerous and risky military and security competition that didn't really affect much else. Now, to the extent that we are in a really deep adversarial relationship between the United States and China. It affects everything. It affects security, obviously, but it also affects economics. It's very hard for us, either of us, to grow if we're not trading and doing business with each other. It affects technology. It affects innovation. It affects the international cooperation. And so it's a much more comprehensive set of challenges. Now, the good news is because we have so much at stake with each other, there are many more reasons to try to manage these differences. But if we can't, the consequences in some ways could be even worse than during the Cold War.
I see. Dr. Funabashi, Lee Hsien-loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, wrote in Foreign Affairs that the troubled Chinese-US relationship raises profound questions about Asia's future and the shape of the emerging international order. Actually, Asian countries are concerned a lot about being caught in the middle. What can they do? To choose one side over the other, try to mediate, try hedging, or take case-by-case approach? What do you think is a wise way to do this at this moment?
Well, for the time being, I think that Asian countries will have to manage to cope with this coronavirus challenge. But on this account, I think that East Asian countries such as Korea and Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, and Thailand, Malaysia, actually have, I think, weathered this challenge skillfully. So certainly the game is not over. The jury is still out. But after the post-corona world, East Asia, I think, will likely emerge to be in a much more stronger position. And I think that's is one of the promising prospect in that East Asia would be in a better position to resist the protectionism even more unleashed by the coronavirus crisis. And so as for CPTPP, for instance, I think that Japan and with like-minded countries, and hopefully, including Korea in the future, and eventually the United States returning, I think should really explore how to strengthen that multilateral, and open regional architecture. And also, I think that perhaps Vietnam will likely emerge as a major player in post-corona world, as increasing number of the countries will pursue to diversify their global supply chain from China to other countries, and Vietnam perhaps will be one of the most, I think, promising country to host those, to welcome those new investments. India, perhaps, after its clash with China, will most likely be aligned with the United States and with Australia, Japan, in more serious way. So I think that's the India will always has been much more cautious in being aligned with the United States and Japan and Australia in the past, but now I think that it's fundamentally changed. So I think that's it is time for those like-minded countries to strengthen their cooperation, to strengthen its balance vis-a-vis China in various ways.
I see. Dr. Han, I would like to ask same questions. Korea is one of the countries who are sandwiched between the US and China. And what do you think is the best way for South Korea to handle this situation?
Well, I think on the coronavirus issue, Mr. Trump chose the wrong way in dealing with the China-US relations in connection with the virus. He placed the blame on China as a way of lessening blame on him and trying to divert the responsibility to another country. I think he should have used, if he was wise and capable person, a reason to be more cooperative rather than to be fighting over who is more responsible on this issue. Now, there will be cases where South Korea will have to make certain choices, but it's not a choice between China and the United States. The choice will be how to deal with China and how to deal with the United States. And South Korea has a very clear path, which is South Korea deals with the United States as an ally of 70 years and still going strong. South Korea has to deal with China as a country which it wants to be friendly with and also have very heavy, large sums of trade going on. Now, I think in the past, South Korea made some mistakes by being ambiguous on this issue and saw this and presented this as a case of choosing between China and the United States. But I think ultimately the circumstances will require South Korea to make the necessary choice, which is, as far as the alliance issue is concerned, South Korea has to place the most highest priority on that issue, and on trade issues, do as much as possible to continue that heavy traffic in terms of trade and economic relations with China.
Professor Steinberg, do you understand this situation of Asian countries who feel like they are like being caught in the middle of United States and China, and they face with the difficult choices between those two countries? And then, what's your advice for the countries who are in that situation?
Well, let me start with my advice for our country, which is I don't think we should try to put our friends in an either-or position vis-a-vis China. I think it's not in our interest or their interest. And I think we have to be cautious if we do about the risk of how they will decide, particularly if the United States continues to pursue an America First policy that seems as uninterested in the welfare of our allies as it is in the welfare of our adversaries. You know, I've been deeply disturbed by the way the Trump administration has treated our allies on everything. We've just seen in the last couple of weeks in this spat between Trump and the German government, in which we've threatened to pull our troops out of Germany. It's heartbreaking as someone who's been involved in managing alliance relations both in Europe and in Asia for the last 40 years, such indifference to the concerns and the interests of our best friends. And so we don't want to make this an either-or choice. It's good for the United States that Japan and China have managed to stabilize their relationship. We don't want a war between Japan and China. We don't want a war between Korea and China or Indonesia or Malaysia or Vietnam or anybody else. And I have a lot of confidence in our partners in East Asia that they don't also want to be swallowed up by China. And so we have to be available and supportive and understand their needs and interests and not make everything a choice of our way or the highway. And I think if we do, and we show some sensitivity to the fact that Korea has big economic stakes with China, just as Indonesia does, and Malaysia and Japan, and that we can't expect them just to throw those overboard to satisfy us. I have confidence that everything that Ambassador Han said is right, that in the end of the day, South Korea will make the choice that's in South Korea's interest, which is ultimately, if it has to choose, to support the country that has been on South Korea's side and supported South Korea. But we have to continue to earn that confidence and trust.
What do you think about President Trump's managing, the way of managing, I mean, the alliance between Korea and the United States? I mean, as according to board,
I think it's dreadful. I think that the president has, in this and everything else, been very clear. It's America first. It's about us, and that's all. We're in it for us, right? And we've seen this in the debate over the host nation support and the demands of the Trump administration to quadruple the amount that South Korea pays. We expect our allies to do their part. It's important for these discussions to take place, but we have to understand we don't do this just as a favor to South Korea. It's in our interest to have South Korea as a partner, just as it's in our interest to have Japan as a partner. So this is not somehow some charitable favor that we're doing that we need to get paid back for. And I think that there are many things to be critical of the Trump administration about, but very near the top of my list, and this is the management of alliance relations, in which we just simply said that we really aren't very interested in the welfare or the well-being of our partners. It's just what's in it for us.
Dr. Han, Trump administration is promoting economic prosperity network, which is EPN plans, that receives lukewarm reactions from neighboring countries. And the US react negatively to China's Belt and Road Initiative and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and so on. So what do you think US is trying to do, and what should Asian countries do? And do you think these two kind of system or network could coexist?
Well, on many of some of the proposals that the United States is making, I've been trying to get clear answers to the authorities in Washington, what they mean by Indo-Pacific strategy. What do you mean by EPI, for example? I don't really get very clear-cut answers. I think one problem here is that Trump, as he says, sees or characterizes China as a revisionist power, which is intent on striking down the status quo, and the United States has to maintain it. I think both China and the United States should recognize that they depend on each other very much. You have a term for that is interdependency. If the United States places too much tariff on goods food products going to China, it will hurt the American farmers probably more than Chinese consumers. If China sells American sovereign national bonds, then it will deplete the Chinese financial power and undervalue, bring down the value of the bonds that the Chinese have in abundance. And so they have to recognize the interdependence, and that, as Mr. Steinberg said, this game is not a non-zero-sum game between China and the United States. Therefore, I think both countries, especially the United States, needs a government which recognizes that between the two countries, the relationship is a non-zero sum, not a zero-sum game.
Let's move on to trade issues. Dr. Funabashi, what do you think is the state of trade relations between U.S. and China, and what do you think is the implications of each side policies over their domestic policies? So what's President Trump's political interest in trade, and what's Xi Jinping's interest in the trade with the U.S.?
Yeah, before getting into that question and responding to that, let me just briefly touch on that issue that you have raised, U.S. China relationship, particularly that Trump administration's stance on the allies. That has been really troubling, in my view. Trump has pursued a very short-term, zero-sum transactional approach to the U.S. allies, and the allies, including Japan, really feel so uncomfortable, even feel being used as a pawn by the United States. And I think that, it really will be detrimental to the US based alliance system. And it has already done great damage. Certainly, Trump is justified in putting China on the spot for China's bullying tactics and economic coercion and expanding sphere of influence and the others. But at the same time, that the U.S. allies actually have felt very much, uneasy about this. Obama administration famously pursued a rebalancing strategy towards Asia Pacific. But rebalancing strategy already has been completely embraced here in Asia, East Asia. They do not need to be told by Washington any longer. That as Jim said, that the Asia's China's neighbors are not that easy pushovers. We have learned how to resist China's all those coercion and the others. Only that the vacant spot, room to be filled, is that the United States, proactive engagement with Asia Pacific. We are all waiting for the United States to once again come back to Asia. Getting back to trade issues, I think that the trade war is class war. That has been a sort of mantra throughout Trump administration. And you cannot deny some element to this argument. You have to address that disparity issues, income disparity, health disparity, education disparity, inequality. When you really have to get right that trade policy. But nonetheless, I think this narrative actually is very much dangerous if it's very much solidified, because that trade imbalance and the others not primarily caused by more technology advancement and development, and trade is not the major culprit for that U.S. disparity and the others. So I think that the U.S. political leaders really should be advised to come up with that alternative to this trade narrative, that a trade war is class war. And I don't know how they will envision a new narrative, but I think that's very much urgently needed.
Yeah. Professor Steinberg, there's a very harsh, exchange of harsh rhetoric between the U.S. and China these days. And I would like to know whether, what is the public react to that situations? So the U.S. public supports President Trump's China policy and trade policy with the United States, and no, with China.
I think you have to separate the two. I think, as Funabashi-san said, there's been a dramatic deterioration in the public attitude towards China over the last 2 years. Didn't happen right after Trump, but in the last 2 years, it's off the charts. And you can see this in the Pew polls and in the Chicago Council polls, that it has really deteriorated very badly. And at the same time, there isn't a lot of support for Trump's trade policy, because for all the reasons that Yoichi said, Ambassador Han, is that it ends up, hurting these tit for tat measures, ends up hurting Americans too. So I do think, for all the reasons that Yoichi said, it was a very insightful observation that he just made, that the problem is that globalization and trade have had a disproportionate impact on some of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable in the United States. And so there's a lot of focus on that, and it's easy to scapegoat the trade partners, and it's not China. We're scapegoating Japan, and we're scapegoating Korea, and we're scapegoating the EU for these problems. There is an answer to this. I think that just my own answer to Yoichi's very good question is that we have to attend to what we need to do to make our workers more competitive and more able to function in a very changed environment. We just haven't paid enough attention to that. We've had policies that have frankly favored the corporations and the wealthy, and not the people who are most at risk in this changing world of globalization and technological change. So in order to deal with that narrative that he just brilliantly described, we have to make it for the working American to see that they can thrive and succeed, and that the government is on their side, sensitive to the impact for them, and equips them with social safety nets, with skills training, with reliable health care, with all the things they need so that they can still pursue a more open and ultimately more beneficial global economic system.
Well, I cannot help asking the questions related with technology. So let me ask another question about that. So is U.S.-China decoupling in the tech sector and technology sector inevitable? What are the implications for multinational companies, and does it help or hurt U.S. companies? What is it, decoupling in technology?
I don't think this is sustainable. I think that it's a false god, that people are somehow thinking that we can somehow cut ourselves off. But the truth is that because of the way innovations work, they're not like physical goods, which you can stop at customs ports and inspect and prevent people from exporting. Many years ago, when I worked in the Clinton administration, we were very worried about the implications of the export of strong encryption. We were afraid that terrorists and criminals would get our hands on it. And so we tried to stop the export of strong encryption, except to a very few countries that had good protections. But the problem was that innovation in encryption was taking place all over the world. There were smart people in every country. And so the impact of trying to put those barriers up hurt American firms because we couldn't sell our products, but it didn't stop Israeli firms from developing strong encryption or Polish firms from developing strong encryption. And I think the same is true for AI, for biomedical. In the end, we'll just harm ourselves. Now, it's not to say that there aren't some very sensitive technologies with direct military applications that we have to try our best to control. But the idea that we can somehow build a world and exclude China from the technology we develop, or that China can develop a world that excludes us, I think it's just doesn't bear any relationship to the reality of the way the technological innovation takes place.
Well, U.S. has forbidden other countries to use Huawei and nuke and so many other stuffs. So that forces other countries to do very difficult choices, right?
But it doesn't decouple the technologies, because mean, people are going to be able to access the innovations from either side. And so it's not as if we can prevent people from, learning what Huawei is about, or Huawei learning about what Qualcomm is about, or whatever. So I think that, we can try to, use our economic leverage to favor American firms. That's different from technological decoupling. That's just trying to use the leverage of that whatever we have to get people to buy American stuff. And I think, up to a point that will work. But it's a very costly thing to do, because you have to spend a lot to get people to be willing to do that.
Okay. Dr. Funabashi, how important do you think internal political issues are, such as democracy, human rights, or Hong Kong issues in China's relations and the United States? Where does Japan stand on this issue?
Well, I think it's getting much more important issue as we have been going through the coronavirus crisis. For instance, China has sought to expand its political influence by propagating China's success in dealing with this COVID-19, crisis, and the failure of the United States to do that. And by associating this with differences of political system. And on the other hand, the United States, for instance, Matt Pottinger promoted freedom and democracy directly to the Chinese public on May 4th. As if he is urging that Chinese citizens to stand up against the Communist Party regime. And this Hong Kong thing, this national security law are now being applied to Hong Kongers, I think also could signal a new mode of thinking of that weaponizing human rights and democracy in shaping U.S. China relationship in the coming decade. As United States and to some extent the other countries now have sought to spot that political leadership and some cadres of Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, as a target. It's not economic sanctions. It's a clear distinction between the public and the political leadership and political apparatchik. And this could, in a way, pose serious risks to stabilizing the U.S.-China relationship and, in more general terms, that global order. You have to be very careful. You really have to certainly be aware and conscious of that human rights violation, gross violation, such as Xinjiang Uyghur and Hong Kong. But that does not mean that it should be translated into economic sanctions policy. No. And particularly if it would be on the verge of dividing the public and political leadership and regime. I think that confessional belief system and regime should be respected. Although we should also be mindful of that, the values of that we should uphold.
Well, Professor Steinberg, if the U.S. has been concerned in Hong Kong and human rights issues, and well, there's always a very strong and negative reaction from China. And how do you think is the best way to handle that situation, which looks very sensitive?
The first thing is I think we have to be clear and direct and honest, which is that when China represses human rights, as Funabashi-san said, whether it's among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or backtracks on its commitments to Hong Kong, we should speak up. And we should not be afraid that somehow it will offend China that we speak up. That's what we believe in. We believe in the universality of these rights. China itself signed the Universal Declaration. And so I don't think we should be intimidated or worry about the reaction when we speak up. But I also think that we have to recognize that we aren't going to coerce the Chinese government into changing its system. It will change in China, and I hope it will change in China, because over time people will not want to live where their rights are systematically denied, and that over time people will find a way to seek their freedom. We saw this all through the 19th century in Europe, right, where the autocratic and the old tried to keep freedom and national expression from moving forward, and ultimately it prevailed. So I believe that. But I think we have to be clear about that. And if it bothers the Chinese leadership, so be it. But I think we also, and I think that Funabashi-san has got it exactly right, that isn't our business to overthrow the regime. It's our business to shine a spotlight on the values that we are committed to.
Dr. Han, do you think President Trump and Kim Jong-un tried some kind of deal before election, or do you think Kim Jong-un will postpone it to after election? Which one do you prefer to predict?
Well, Kim Jong-un, as he did before, sees an opportunity in Mr. Trump in that when his stocks are up, he is buoyed by his power and his glory, that he will try to get something done on the North Korean issue. Right now, as his political stocks are going down, he needs something to make up for it. And whatever it is, as Mr. Bolton says, in Mr. Trump's mind, the actual security of the United States and allies is secondary to his political interests. And if he thinks that it fits his political interest, he will make a deal. He will spin it and sell it to the American public, hoping that that will bring in a few dozen electoral college votes here and there. And I think that is an opportunity that Kim Jong-un will not want to miss. And I think some of the shadow dances that we see, such as inviting President Moon to the G7, G11 meeting, and Kim Jong-un's appearance of being moderate on dealing with South Korea, and even the United States is not unrelated to their ultimate or ulterior motive to come to some terms to use it as a political trophy on both sides. And so they have an interest in making a deal. What kind of a deal is a question, but they will try to make it look good, whatever the ultimate product is.
Same question to Dr. Funabashi. Do you think there's still a chance for President Trump and the Kim Jong-un try some kind of deal?
Well, I think we, to some extent, touch on this issue already. So I don't want to repeat the same thing, but I don't think that they will likely have another chance to have the summit meeting before the election. Because Trump may find that tension between Washington and Pyongyang more appealing to his electioneering. And I think that so I don't think that Trump administration, particularly Trump himself, feels necessary to intervene in the U.S.-North Korean relationship to prevent that a situation from deteriorating. He may even be tempted to see that further deterioration of that relationship until that November 3rd. I don't think the North Korean side will be able to make a final decision to denuclearize. They have never been, put that denuclearization on their list, and even Trump, I hope, would not be deluded by North Korea's prospect to, abandoning on nuclear weapons before the election. So I don't think that North Korea will commit firmly to their nuclearization, as they have not done in the previous two summit meetings.
Well, this is an open question. The relations between the U.S. and China is getting worse and getting hostile, but I don't think we see any military implications so far. So if there's a kind of military conflict or any kind of dispute could break out, geographically, where do you think is the most dangerous place? Who's gonna go first?
I think most dangerous place is the geo-economic battleground that the world is now seeing between the U.S. and China and the like-minded countries of the United States. If we would not cope with this new challenge effectively, then I think that it would embolden China to test us militarily. Okay. So far, they have refrained from doing that, challenging the U.S. hegemony militarily. They have very much confined that challenge to economic statecraft arena. Okay, so we really have to win in this arena, so that China should not be emboldened to test us militarily. And I think that's maybe a bit too provocative word, win or war. But nonetheless, I think that geoeconomics is a major battleground, and China must understand that there got to be a limit, and that they have to uphold that international law and the basic principles of international organizing principle enshrined in the United Nations Charter and WTO. So I think that geoeconomics and economic statecraft is that most crucial area that we really have to compete with China, and we have to cooperate among like-minded countries like the United States, South Korea, and Japan.
So basically, you see the situation, the confrontation between U.S. and China is getting worse, right? I see.
So
How about-
I'll give my 2 cents on this, which is I think the most dangerous place is the same place that's been the most dangerous place for the last 70 years, which is Taiwan. I think that one of the great achievements of U.S.-China relations over the last 70 years is that we've managed not to go to war over Taiwan, and that we've understood that we have fundamental differences, but that we have more at stake in managing it than trying to resolve it. But I always have worried, and I continue to worry, that that calculus could change. And I especially worry these days that there may be a miscalculation on the part of the Chinese leadership, that either because they think the US is distracted from COVID, or because President Trump's America First thing doesn't really care about others, that maybe this is the window of opportunity, as people say, to do something to resolve the ambiguity and to make good on the longstanding pledge of the Chinese leadership to reunite the country. So I think that remains a danger. Certainly, there has been no progress in the bilateral relationship between Taiwan and Beijing, and that makes it difficult. I think that, you know, President Tsai got a very strong vote of confidence from her people, and China needs to understand what that represents. I think we need to be very clear about the stakes here, and to make China behave cautiously, because I do think if there were to be a serious confrontation, that to my mind is both the most likely and the most dangerous in the near term.
Okay, so Taiwan.
But
Dr. Han,
China will use force, one, in order to teach a lesson, whether it's Vietnam or India. Two, when there is a vital interest involved, that's when the Chinese got into the Korean War, for example. And so at this time, I don't think there is any real chance that China considers any situation vital enough to use force and start a large-scale war. But China has engaged in smaller scale conflicts. Just a couple of days ago, there were shooting war between India and China in the Himalayas, and dozens of soldiers were killed, for example. Those are small-scale clashes that can be handled, I think, and both sides are trying to cope with that. But what we cannot prevent, what we cannot predict, is accidental war, and that will escalate. And that possibility still exists in connection with Taiwan and South China Sea.
So you say Taiwan and South China Sea. So actually,
yes.
Then, Dr. Han, so don't you agree with the theory of Graham Allison destined to war? The conflict between the rising power and status quo power could be destined to a war. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's people talk about the so-called Cold War, but the situation here is very different from the Cold War of the 20th century between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ideology is not such an important element here. The military configuration is not such that it's a Cold War only because there is no actual shooting war, and there is so much interdependence in the economy, and therefore I think there's all kinds of reasons and incentives for both powers to prevent any large flare-up. of military conflict.
Can I just add a word here, and with all due respect to my good friend Graham Allison, his analysis is historically inaccurate and certainly doesn't apply to the U.S. China context. Since Sparta didn't go to war because of the rise of Athens and the fear that had incited in Sparta.
Right.
They actually gotten into war largely because of alliance entrapment. So it's a whole different set of issues. And more importantly, we've had situations where rising powers and established powers didn't go to war, the most important of which was between the United Kingdom and the United States at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. That's to say that there aren't risks in the US-China relationship, but it's not destined for war. It will come about because leaders on both sides made poor choices. And so this is absolutely manageable if both sides are determined to manage it. And we've seen many instances of history of why it has been done. But we've also seen many instances where it failed by lack of leadership, by lack of foresight, by an excessive fear of the other, an excessive focus on domestic politics. So I think the challenge now is for the leadership of both countries to both understand the risk of war, but not to simply shrug their shoulders and say, well, bring it on because it's destined to happen no matter what we do.
Okay, and I would like to, I'm so much relieved because no one mentioned the Korean Peninsula as one of the kind of dangerous place, just in case. I mean, Professor Steinberg, could you explain what is the kind of basic implications for Korean Peninsula as the confrontation between the U.S. and China gets worse? How do you think it will affect in a kind of big picture? Where does it go?
I think both of my colleagues have made some very thoughtful observations about this. It is harder to manage the North Korea problem if the United States and China aren't working together effectively, because if we can surround North Korea on all sides, both literally and figuratively, and demonstrate that none of us support provocation, none of us support the continued development of missiles and nuclear, there's a better chance that North Korea will restrain itself. And conversely, if for all the reasons that both Ambassador Han and Yoichi Funabashi have said, if the North Koreans think that China has their back, it becomes easier for them to escape the impact of sanctions, to be more provocative and the like. We saw this back during the early Obama administration with the attack on the island and on the South Korean destroyer. And so it definitely is harder to manage this when we're not working together. And it is harder to work together on this when we're largely seeing each other as adversaries. It's not impossible. The US, Japan, and Korea working together can still be a very effective force, but there's no question that this makes it more difficult.
Okay, we have 3 minutes, so I would like to give you 1 minute to close today's discussion. Perhaps it's going to be about what is the best way for each country to get the best out of this pressured situation between the confrontational atmosphere between the US and China. May we start, Dr. Funabashi?
Yeah, I think it's a high time for the US, South Korea, and Japan to reestablish the trilateral cooperation among three. It has been missing, and it's very much deplorable to see that that trilateral cooperation almost disappearing for various reasons. And I think that I hope that after the election in November, with a new leadership from the United States, I think it would be a moment for, once again, for three countries to really start to work together, to cooperate.
Dr. Han?
Well, there are things that we should do and we should not do. And Dr. Funabashi said good and relevant things about what we should do. But there are also things that we should not do, which we sometimes do. And that includes being vague and undecided about things. And thought, for example, I don't want to go into the explanation of it, but was a case which in which some D kind of position, which gave false expectation to China that South Korea will knuckle under Chinese pressure. I think we should not, that is, in this case, South Korea should not try to mix security issues with economic and other issues. Dysomia, for example, was studied basically unrelated to security issue and as a bilateral issue between Japan and South Korea. But the United States became much more deeply involved in this. And this was very, very unwise on the part of South Korea to make it into a controversial issue. So, in conclusion,
we are running out of time.
And pragmatic.
Yeah, we are running out of time. So do you have a very short comment, Professor Steinberg?
Just very briefly, I think the most valuable thing our friends in South Korea and Japan can do is to make clear to their friends in Washington that a Cold War is neither desirable nor inevitable, and that we all need to work hard both to stand up to our principles, but also to try to find a way to develop a new direction in Sino-US relations.
Okay. Okay, thank you for sharing with your expertise and insights with us today. I do appreciate it. And thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kanji.